Have you ever wondered what would happen if a man could be two things at once? A ruthless warrior on the battlefield and a disciplined monk in the chapel? And have you ever asked yourself a stranger question? Who helped shape the earliest habits of banking in medieval Europe? Why does a simple date, Friday the 13th, still feel cursed to this day? These questions seem unrelated, but in the medieval world, they all point to a single name. A military brotherhood so feared, so admired, and so politically dangerous that kings tried to erase it from history. They were the Knights Templar. To understand why they existed, we have to return to one city, a city claimed by three faiths, three histories, and three destinies: Jerusalem. For Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, Jerusalem was not just land, it was memory, it was prophecy, it was sacred geography. And when sacred geography becomes a prize, it becomes a battlefield. In the late 11th century, the First Crusade was launched. From 1096 to 1099, armies from Western Europe marched toward the Levant. By the end, Jerusalem fell under Christian control, and a new Crusader state rose, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. At first, it looked like victory. Pilgrims poured in from Europe, desperate to walk where they believed Jesus had walked. Ships could bring travelers to the coast with relative safety. But the road from the coast to Jerusalem was another story. Caravans of pilgrims, tired, untrained, carrying money and supplies, were ambushed by bandits, raiders, and hostile forces along the route. Many were robbed, many were killed, and the Holy Land, newly conquered, suddenly demanded a new kind of protection. That is where the story of the Templars begins. Around 1119, a French knight named Jacques de Molay, along with a small group of companions, approached the rulers of Jerusalem with a proposal. They would form a brotherhood. They would take on a sacred mission to protect pilgrims on the dangerous roads to the holy city. At first, they were not famous, they were not rich, they were not even many. They were, in the beginning, only a handful of men, bound not by blood, but by vows. And here is the paradox that made them legendary. They did not vow to become mere soldiers, they vowed to become something harsher. They vowed poverty, chastity, obedience. They lived like monks, praying, fasting, sleeping simply, but they fought like heavy cavalry, trained for shock and impact. A warrior monk was not a new idea in religion, but in medieval Europe, it was a revolutionary weapon. The Brotherhood was granted a headquarters near the Temple Mount, the site associated with the ancient Temple of Solomon. From that location came their name, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. In simpler words, the Knights Templar. Their early years were difficult. They lacked manpower, they lacked equipment, they survived on donations and fragile political support. But that support grew. In 1129, at the Council of Troyes, the order gained formal recognition. Religious leaders shaped rules for their life, rules designed to turn men into disciplined instruments. They were forbidden to seek luxury, forbidden to flee battle without command, forbidden to fight for personal glory. The Templar ideal was simple, terrifying, and efficient. A knight should not fight for himself. He should fight as a unit, as a vow, as a machine of faith. Over time, their white mantle, marked with a red cross, became an omen. On one side, it meant protection and sanctuary. On the other, it meant death. Because once the Templars were fully formed, they became more than an escort. They became the spearhead. Templar cavalry fought as heavy shock troops, armored riders trained to break lines with momentum and discipline. In battles across the Levant, their charge was not chaos, it was geometry. A wedge of steel, a moving wall, a controlled collision. And sometimes, their presence altered outcomes far beyond their numbers. Consider the Battle of Montgisard in 1177. The Christian forces were smaller and vulnerable. On the opposite side stood the great Muslim leader, Saladin, commanding a much larger army. By every normal calculation, the Crusader forces should have been crushed. But the Crusader king, Baldwin IV, young, ill, and underestimated, committed to a sudden strike. And within that desperate assault, disciplined heavy cavalry played a role that mattered. The ability to hit hard, stay coherent, and exploit panic. Montgisard became one of those medieval moments where speed, timing, and morale reshaped what raw numbers predicted. Not because the Templars were magical, but because they were trained to do what ordinary men could not: advance into danger without breaking. And yet, warfare was only half of their power. The other half was something quieter, something that would eventually terrify kings more than swords: money. The medieval world was dangerous for travelers, not only because of weapons, but because of wealth. If a pilgrim carried gold, he carried death on his belt. So, the Templars offered a solution. A traveler could deposit valuables with the order in Europe and receive a written credit, a document that could be redeemed later in the Holy Land. In practice, it functioned like an early form of letters of credit, reducing risk, moving wealth, and creating trust across long distances. Over time, the Templars became guardians, not only of roads, but of vaults, contracts, and networks. They handled donations, they managed estates, they operated farms, they moved resources between continents, and in a fractured medieval economy, a disciplined, transnational order became something dangerously rare: reliable. That reliability brought them influence. Influence brought them enemies. Because in history, there is a rule that repeats with brutal consistency. The moment you become essential, someone powerful begins to imagine life without you. By the late 13th century, the Crusader states were weakening. The Holy Land was increasingly contested. Strategic defeats and shifting alliances squeezed Christian control. Templar fortresses still stood. Templar ships still sailed. Templar wealth still circulated. But their original mission, protecting a stable Christian Jerusalem, was collapsing under the weight of reality. And as their purpose blurred, their image became easier to attack. Rumors spread, accusations multiplied. People whispered about secret rituals, hidden relics, forbidden knowledge. Most of these stories were not proven. Some were invented. But when political desire meets public fear, truth becomes optional. Then came the year 1307. In France, King Philip IV, called the Fair, was powerful, ambitious, and drowning in financial pressure. He had wars to fund, a kingdom to stabilize, debts to manage. And among his creditors and rivals stood an order that answered to no king, only to the church. An order with property, fortresses, and money. So Philip chose a solution that was not economic, but violent. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, agents of the French crown moved with coordination and speed. Templars were arrested across France. Doors were broken under torchlight. Men were dragged from beds, records seized, treasuries searched. And then the interrogations began. The accusations were extreme: heresy, blasphemy, corruption, secret sins. Under torture, some confessed. Under pain, men will say almost anything to make suffering stop. What mattered was not whether the accusations were true. What mattered was that the accusations were useful. Philip pushed the church to act. Pope Clement V, caught between spiritual authority and political reality, eventually yielded to pressure. In 1312, the order was formally dissolved. The Knights Templar, once the elite guardians of pilgrimage and war, was stripped of their name. Some members were absorbed into other orders. Some disappeared into private life. Some died in prison. But the symbol of the Templars did not die quietly, because in 1314, their last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was executed in Paris, burned alive. And here, history slides into legend. Stories claim that as the flames rose, de Molay issued a curse, calling powerful men to stand before God's judgment. Within months and years, both Pope Clement V and King Philip IV died. And in the imagination of Europe, the narrative locked into place. A sacred brotherhood was betrayed, a curse was spoken, and Friday the 13th became for some a mark of dread. Whether the curse was real is not the point. The point is what people needed to believe. They needed a myth big enough to explain something terrifying, that an organization built on discipline and faith could be destroyed by politics and fear, and that power, no matter how holy it looks, is always vulnerable to the hunger of other power. So what is the true legacy of the Knights Templar? Not the treasure myths, not the Hollywood conspiracies, not the fantasy of hidden relics. Their real legacy is sharper. They prove that discipline can turn a small group into a force that reshapes history. They prove that trust, managed at scale, can be as powerful as armies. And they prove that when a brotherhood becomes too wealthy, too connected, too independent, it stops being a tool of the system and becomes a threat to it. In the end, the Templars were not destroyed because they were weak. They were destroyed because they were strong in the wrong place, strong enough to make kings feel poor and popes feel cornered. And that is why, centuries later, their name still survives. Because history forgets many armies, but it does not forget contradictions. A monk with a sword, a prayer spoken inside armor,